What if some of the most profound insights Carl Jung ever had about death, the soul, and what happens after we die were never meant to be made public? What if he left behind private notes? Not just clinical observations or theories, but deeply personal, mystical, and spiritually explosive writings that were so controversial. They were buried for years, not because they were unimportant, but because they revealed something too powerful, too unsettling. Something the world, or at least the academic world, wasn't ready to face. In this video, we're going to uncover those very notes. Hidden reflections Carl Jung recorded later in life after a near-death experience that shook him to his core. Writings that explored the soul's journey beyond the body and the subtle boundary between this life and what might lie beyond it. But here's the twist. These insights weren't tucked away in some dusty archive by accident. They were deliberately kept out of the spotlight. Why? Because they challenged everything. And the scientific world thought it knew about psychology, spirituality, and even human identity itself. Jung had always walked a fine line between science and spirit. But in these hidden notes, he crossed a threshold. He began speaking of the soul not as a metaphor, but as a real living presence, one that exists beyond time and perhaps even beyond death. And once you hear what he saw, felt, and wrote, you may never think about your own life or your own mortality in quite the same way again. You won't find these notes in your typical psychology textbook. They weren't taught in grad school. But they matter now more than ever, especially in a world that's more disconnected from its soul than it realizes. So if you've ever felt like there's something more, if you've ever sensed that death might not be the end, but a transition into something deeper, you're in the right place. Because what Jung left behind wasn't just a theory. It was a message, one that was hidden for decades. And now, it's time we finally hear it. Let's go back in time to a moment most people never talk about when they mention Carl Jung. It's 1944. Jung is 68 years old. He's just suffered a massive heart attack. His body is weak. He slips into a near-death state. And while the doctors work to save him, something extraordinary happens. Jung has a vision what many today might call a near-death experience. He later describes leaving his body floating above the earth and approaching what he called a cosmic temple, a vast, luminous space he somehow knew was sacred. Inside this temple, he sensed a kind of total knowledge, a profound awareness of existence that went far beyond anything he had ever encountered in his scientific work. But just as he's about to enter something or someone pulls him back, he wakes up in his hospital bed. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Following this experience, Jung began writing things he'd never shared before, not in his published books, not in lectures, and certainly not in front of his scientific peers. These notes were private, personal, spiritual, and in many ways, dangerous. Not because they promoted fear, but because they challenged the limits of what was considered acceptable in the field of psychology. In these hidden writings, Jung began speaking more openly about the soul not as a symbol, but as a real and living presence. He described the afterlife as a continuation, not an end. He suggested that what we call death might actually be a threshold, a return, or even a revelation of who we really are beneath the ego. He wasn't just theorizing anymore. He was remembering something he saw. And this created a problem. Well, you see, by the 1940s, Carl Jung was already world famous. His work on archetypes, dreams, the collective unconscious, it had made a huge impact. He was respected, admired, but also watched closely. And the people around him, his family, his students, his publishers, they were protective. They wanted to preserve his legacy. They wanted to keep him in the realm of science, not mysticism. So when Jung started sharing thoughts about the soul's journey after death, about temples of truth and other realms of consciousness, it made people nervous. Not because they thought he was lying, but because they feared what the truth might do to his reputation. Would the public think he'd lost his mind? Would his scientific credibility be ruined? And so many of these writings were quietly set aside, filed, stored, buried. It wasn't until decades later after his death that some of these pages started to surface. And even then, they weren't released all at once. Some appeared in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But even that book, believe it or not, was edited heavily before publication. Some of the deepest spiritual content omitted. Some of his most direct experiences with altered states softened or cut entirely. Because the truth was too radical, too ahead of its time. But fast forward to today, and something fascinating is happening. We're now living in an age where conversations about consciousness, near-death experiences, and the continuation of the soul are no longer taboo. In fact, they're gaining traction scientifically, spiritually, and culturally. Millions of people are asking, what happens when we die? Is there more to us than the body? What is the soul? Really, books on the afterlife are bestsellers. Clinical studies on near-death experiences are published in major journals. Documentaries, podcasts, and even therapists are beginning to explore what Jung was writing about over 70 years ago. So in a way, the world is finally catching up to Jung. But here's the powerful part. Jung didn't write those notes for fame. He didn't write them to prove anything. He wrote them because he had to. Because what he experienced wasn't just for him. It was for anyone who had ever wondered, is there something more? Does the soul survive? What happens on the other side of consciousness? And what he tried to describe, often in poetic, symbolic, even mystical language, was a message that the psyche is bigger than we think, that the self extends beyond death, and that remembering this could change how we live. Now, imagine being in his position. You've spent your entire life as a thinker, a scientist, a psychologist, and suddenly you're thrown into an experience that can't be explained by science alone. What would you do? Would you stay quiet? Would you protect your name? Or would you write it down anyway, knowing full well the world might not be ready? That's exactly what Jung did. He wrote for the future, for people like us who are just now beginning to rediscover what he glimpsed all those years ago. So why were these writings buried? Because they were too honest, too strange, too soulful. But now, as more and more of them come to light, the question becomes, what will we do with them? Will we dismiss them like so many did in the past? Or will we read them with open hearts, curious minds, and the humility to admit, maybe Jung did see something real, and maybe we've been ignoring it for far too long. You could let me leave you with this. If even half of what Jung saw was true, if the soul does go on, if death isn't the end, but a return to something eternal, then everything changes. Not just how we die, but how we live. Let's step deeper now beyond theory, beyond metaphor, into one of the most mysterious and intimate parts of Carl Jung's legacy, what he saw, what he felt about death. Now keep in mind, this wasn't an idea he came up with in a lab. It wasn't a philosophical musing written from a safe distance. This came after Jung's near-death experience in 1944, an experience that changed him forever. And in the notes he left behind, you can hear it not just as a psychologist speaking, but as a man who had brushed against the veil and returned with something too real to ignore. So what exactly did Jung say? First, he made one thing very clear. My consciousness was not in the body. It was floating. But I was still me. That one sentence is profound, because in just a few words, he challenges one of the core assumptions of materialist science, that consciousness is tied to the brain, and that when the body dies, the self disappears. But Jung didn't experience that. He left the body, and he remained himself, not confused, not fragmented, not hallucinating, but aware, intact, at peace. He would describe floating high above the Earth, seeing the planet from orbit long before images from space were publicly available. He recalled a sense of detachment from all earthly concerns, no more anxiety, no more identity, just a serene, expanded awareness. But that wasn't all. He saw something else, something sacred, a temple, suspended in space, radiant, silent, majestic. And in that moment, Jung knew this wasn't just a vision. This was a threshold, a place beyond ego, beyond time, a symbolic gateway to something deeper than life as we know it. He described feeling pulled toward it as if everything in his soul was saying, yes, this is where I belong. But he didn't enter, not because he didn't want to, but because something pulled him back. A voice, a force, a tether to the physical world. He wasn't finished yet. Now here's where it gets even more intriguing. After this experience, Jung wrote extensively but privately about the nature of the self and what he believed happens after death. To Jung, the self wasn't just a psychological concept. It was the center and totality of the psyche, the part of us that holds our conscious mind, our unconscious patterns, our shadow, our light. And something more. He came to believe that the self does not die when the body dies. Instead, it transforms. Death, he said, is not a wall. It's a threshold. Not the end of consciousness, but the beginning of a different mode of being. He wrote about how the ego dissolves, but the self remains. That we move from form into symbol, from limitation into totality. He didn't claim to know where the soul goes. But he knew deeply that it doesn't simply vanish. And that changes everything. He said, because if the self continues, if consciousness evolves, if death is a passage, not a termination, then so much of what we fear about it is based on a misunderstanding. We don't fear death. We fear losing ourselves. But Jung's experience suggests we don't lose the self at all. In fact, we might finally meet it. Now let's pause here and reflect. Have you ever had a moment, maybe in a dream, or during deep meditation, or standing alone in nature, where time felt suspended, where your body was still, but your awareness expanded, where you felt more you than ever before? Jung would say, that's a glimpse of the self. That's a taste of what lives beyond the veil, not as a fantasy, but as a reality we've simply forgotten. One of the most beautiful aspects of Jung's description is how peaceful it was. There was no fear, no judgment, only light, silence, a sense of being held by something vast and intelligent and kind. This is not the afterlife of fire and brimstone. It's not a place of punishment or reward. It's a return, a movement toward the archetypal source. the place from which the self came, and to which it longs to go back. It's not about escaping the world. It's about completing the journey of becoming. And this idea wasn't just personal to Jung. It aligned with something he observed in myths, dreams, and ancient spiritual traditions. From the Egyptian Book of the Dead to Tibetan teachings. From Christian mysticism to Gnostic texts. Many traditions describe death not as an annihilation, but as a continuation, a deepening, a reunion. Jung believed that these were not primitive superstitions, but symbolic maps of the soul's evolution. He saw death as the final initiation, the moment when the fragmented ego gives way to the whole self. So why does this matter now in our world today? Because we live in a culture obsessed with youth productivity and physical survival, but deeply uncomfortable with the idea of mortality. We avoid talking about death. We sterilize it. We fear it. And in doing so, we miss one of life's most powerful truths, that facing death honestly can awaken us more fully to life. Jung's writings on the soul offer more than comfort. They offer a framework for wholeness. They suggest that when we stop running from the end, we begin living with more meaning, not less. Jung didn't come back from his near-death experience with all the answers, but he came back with something more important, a question. What if who you are is not limited to what you can see? What if yourself knows something your ego has forgotten? And what if death isn't the end of your story, but the place where the story finally makes sense? Like you may not believe everything Jung saw. You don't have to. But what if, even for a moment, you let the possibility live in you? What if you let it open something? Instead of close something, would you live differently? Would you love more? Honestly, would you listen to your soul just a little more closely? Jung's vision wasn't a conclusion. It was an invitation. To remember, to wonder, to awaken. And maybe that's what the soul has been waiting for all along. Let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortable. When was the last time you thought about death, not in a philosophical way, not as an abstract idea, but in that quiet 2 a.m. kind of way, when the world is silent and your thoughts are loud? If you're like most people, you probably felt a twinge of fear or confusion, or even denial. And there's a reason for that. We live in a time where death has become a taboo, a shadow we push to the corners of our culture out of sight, out of mind. We obsess over youth. We chase productivity. We distract ourselves with noise, with screens, with endless doing. Because deep down, we're terrified of stopping. But what if I told you that our fear of death isn't really about death itself? What if it's about something even deeper? Not knowing who we really are. Carl Jung saw this coming. Long before our world became saturated with self-help slogans and digital avatars, Jung warned of a crisis far more dangerous than any political or economic threat, a crisis of soul. He believed that modern humans had become disconnected from their true nature, from the self. And in that disconnection, we lost something vital. We stopped listening to the part of us that is ancient, eternal, and whole. The part that isn't afraid of death because it understands it. In his hidden notes, Jung didn't just write about what he saw beyond the veil. He wrote about what it meant. He saw that when people don't know who they are, beyond their roles, beyond their jobs, their achievements, their trauma, they start to live in fear. Fear of being invisible. Fear of failure. fear of death. But underneath it all, it's fear of the unknown self. And that fear isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. It drives anxiety, it fuels depression. It creates the kind of quiet despair that's hard to name but easy to feel. In fact, a recent study suggested that over 60% of Americans feel some form of existential anxiety, not just stress or burnout, but a deep sense of being lost. And that's exactly what Jung predicted. Like he wrote that when a culture loses connection to soul, it compensates with noise, with surface-level identity, with distractions that numb but never satisfy. He wasn't condemning technology or modern life. He was calling us to remember what we've forgotten. Man cannot stand a meaningless life. And when death becomes meaningless, life starts to feel meaningless too. But here's where Jung's message becomes not just insightful, but healing. Because in those same notes, he offered something incredibly rare today: reverence for death. Not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a mirror. He described death as a moment of truth, not the end of life, but the beginning of a deeper understanding of it. To Jung, death wasn't something to run from. It was something to be understood. And more than that, it was a teacher. Imagine this. What if the fear you feel about death isn't actually about death? What if it's about losing your identity because you've never fully met yourself? What if the panic you feel in moments of stillness isn't emptiness, but the invitation of your soul? That's the question Jung quietly leaves us with. And it's a powerful one, because when we finally stop running, when we dare to turn inward instead of outward, something shifts. Vort, you might ask, but how does this help me here and now? Great question. Because let's be honest, most of us aren't spending our days reading sacred texts or meditating on mortality. We're working, parenting, paying bills, surviving. But what Jung offers isn't abstract. It's practical. It's a call to reconnect with your inner world, to stop measuring your worth by numbers on a screen and start listening to the still, quiet voice within. It's in your dreams, in your intuition, in those strange synchronicities that make you wonder, was that just coincidence or something more? In a world obsessed with external identity, Jung reminds us, you are not your job. You are not your trauma. You are not your follower count. You are something deeper, and the more you connect to that part of you, the less death feels like an enemy, and the more it feels like a homecoming. But let me put it this way, that you wouldn't fear the ocean. If you remembered you were born from water, you wouldn't fear the dark. If you realized your soul knows how to see in it, and you wouldn't fear death. If you had met the part of you that never dies. And Carl Jung's hidden notes are not just psychological curiosities. They're spiritual lanterns, left for those of us who are willing to look past the veil, not to escape life, but to deepen it. And maybe that's why they were buried for so long. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were powerful. Too powerful for a world that wasn't ready. But maybe we're ready now. So here's my question for you. What if your fear of death isn't about ending, but about not knowing who you truly are? What if the real work isn't to conquer death, but to remember the self before it comes? Because when you do that, when you reconnect with the soul underneath all your identities, something beautiful happens. Life begins to feel sacred again. And death becomes a doorway, not a dead end. Carl Jung's hidden notes weren't just about death. They were never meant to be morbid or mysterious for mystery's sake. They were a message for the living, a quiet invitation to stop running from the unknown and start remembering the self that's always been here, quietly waiting. Because when Jung described what he saw beyond the veil, he wasn't trying to prove something. He was trying to remind us that we are more than our bodies, more than our roles or our titles or our fears. We are soul, and soul does not end. Now I want to bring this back to you personally. Ask yourself, when was the last time you felt deeply connected to who you truly are, not who the world expects you to be, but the deeper self beneath it all, the part that isn't shaken by life's chaos, because it remembers something eternal. Jung believed that the reason we fear death so much isn't because of death itself. It's because we've forgotten the self that transcends it. And maybe it's time we remembered. And maybe that's why you're here, not by accident, but because something inside you is waking up. And if even one sentence from Jung's vision stirred something in you, let it take root. Let it grow. Because the more you reconnect with that deeper part of you, the more death begins to lose its power, and the more life begins to feel sacred again. So here's what I'd love to know. Do you believe the soul continues after death? And what part of Jung's vision spoke to you the most deeply? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just a video. It's a conversation. A community of seekers, healers, and souls ready to remember something ancient and true. And if this resonated with you, if it stirred something you can't quite name but don't want to lose, subscribe to this channel, not just for more content, but for more moments like this. Moments that awaken the mind and speak to the soul, because that's what this channel is for, and that's what you deserve. See you in the next video. Until then, stay awake, stay curious, and remember, you are not here by accident. You are here because your soul is ready.